Mysterious cults that haunted the dark ages to fall asleep to the desert does not answer questions. It absorbs them, under a sky bleached pale by unbroken sun. Where wind moves like a whisper searching for a mouth, men once walked away from language itself. They left behind names, kin, and the soft mercy of conversation, stepping instead into a silence so complete it felt like a second death. What kind of devotion demands that even the soul forget how to speak in the 3rd century when the Roman world trembled and cracked? Egypt's wilderness became a refuge for those who believed the end of days was already breathing down the neck of creation. Cities groaned beneath taxes and soldiers. Faith was young and bloodied, and certainty felt like a luxury only the mad could afford. In this uncertainty, men fled eastward, away from markets and councils, toward the empty places where sand swallowed footprints within moments. They did not build churches, they hollowed out caves. They did not preach, they listened. Later generations would call them the Desert Fathers, carving sanctity into their memory. But the men themselves rejected titles. They believed that too. Name something was to claim power over it, and power was a temptation among themselves. They were simply those who waited, those who endured, those who listened for a God who spoke only when the world was quiet enough to hear. Silence was not a discipline for them, it was a weapon. They believed words carried corruption. That speech invited demons to nest in the breath. Every syllable, they said, was a crack through which pride might slip. And so they starved language as they starved flesh. Some spoke only once a year, if at all. Others vowed never to let sound cross their lips again until death released them. Pilgrims who dared to venture into the desert road of meeting men who had not spoken for decades. Their eyes, it was said, were unsettlingly not wild, but emptied, as if whatever once lived behind them had been scraped away by years of sun and hunger. When asked questions, these monks answered with gestures drawn into the sand, then wiped away before the wind could carry meaning to another's soul. Fasting was constant. Food was suspicion. Water was rationed like forgiveness. They believed that. Hunger sharpened the spirit, thinning the veil between the living and the divine. When hallucinations came in, they always did. They were welcomed as visitors, angels or demons. It hardly mattered. Both were tests. Some chained themselves to stone pillars, standing beneath the sun until skin cracked and bled. Others bound themselves inside narrow caves where they could not fully stand nor lie down, keeping the body in a constant state of discomfort. Sleep arrived only in fragments, broken by heat, insects, and prayer pressed inward rather than spoken aloud. Yet it was death that revealed the darkest contours of their devotion. Travelers told of finding bodies seated upright against cave walls, hands folded in unfamiliar patterns, faces calm to the point of terror. Their mouths were sealed with wax, as if to ensure that no final word escaped. No prayer, no cry, just silence preserved even in decay. In some cases, the monks had prepared their own tombs, carving chambers into rock and sealing themselves inside with only enough air to last a few hours. They called it obedience, a final offering, a willing descent into the grave before the grave could come for them. Were these acts holy sacrifices or rehearsals for annihilation? Even contemporaries could not agree. Some church leaders whispered that such men flirted with blasphemy, mistaking self-destruct for sanctity. Others wept at their resolve, calling it the purest form of faith the world had known since the apostles walked barefoot through dust. No single doctrine survived them. They wrote almost nothing. What fragments remained come from observers, pilgrims, bishops, and critics, men who feared them as much as they revered them. Stories contradict one another. One text praises a monk who never spoke and lived a great age, his silence described as luminous. Another condemns a brotherhood that buried its members alive, accusing them of glorifying death rather than resurrection. The truth, if it ever existed cleanly, dissolved into the desert long ago. As Christianity grew more organized, more measured, the silent ones became inconvenient. Faith needed words now. It needed creeds, councils, arguments. Silence was uncontrollable. Some of the Desert Brothers were canonized, their harsher practices softened by time and interpretation. Others were quietly condemned, their names erased. From liturgy, most were simply ignored, left to crumble into legend. Yet the desert remembers. Long after monasteries rose along the Nile, shepherds spoke of finding sealed caves with bones arranged deliberately, bodies positioned as if still waiting. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered cells too narrow for comfort, etched with crosses, so faint they could be mistaken for scratches. Wax residue was found near skulls, hardened like frozen breath. No inscriptions explained the rites. No apologies justified them. What remains unresolved is not what these men did, but why they did it. Did they seek God in the only way they believed possible, by removing every distraction, every comfort, every sound that might mask the divine whisper? Or were they fleeing something else entirely, the noise of humanity, the weight of expectation, the unbearable presence of other voices pressing against their own? Silence, after all, can be refuge as much as reverence. There is something unsettling about a faith that leaves no defense for itself. The silent brothers cannot argue their case. They cannot explain intention or correct misinterpretation. Their devotion consumed even the possibility of testimony. In choosing silence, they surrendered control over how they would be remembered, and perhaps that was the final act of humility. At night, when the desert cools and the wind slips through stone like a cautious intruder, it is easy to imagine those men still there, still listening, still waiting, their mouths sealed not by wax, but by conviction, their prayers pressed so deep inward they became indistinguishable from breath itself. The question they leave behind is not easily dismissed. When faith erases the voice, when devotion demands the surrender of language, who remains to answer when doubt comes knocking? The desert offers no reply. It only listens, as it always has, swallowing words until even the echo forgets its shape. They were accused of drinking blood beneath moonless skies, of sealing their faith with knives instead of prayers. Empires spoke their name in whispers, and when soldiers marched, it was often already too late. Villages lay empty, churches burned, and the accused were gone, either slaughtered or vanished into mountains that refused to give them back. Who were the Paulicians, really? And why did the very idea of them terrify the medieval world? In the 7th century, along the harsh frontier where Byzantium bled into Armenia, faith was not a comfort. It was a battlefield. Empires rose and fell here with exhausting regularity. A theology followed the sword. Christianity, now armored with councils and creeds, demanded obedience as much as belief. Yet in these contested highlands, a different reading of the gospel took root, one that refused both imperial authority and sacred ornament. They called themselves followers of Paul, not the church, not the empire, but the apostle who spoke of spirit and freedom. To their enemies, they became the Paulicians, a name spoken with suspicion and dread. They believed the material world was corrupted at its core, fashioned not by the true God, but by a lesser, malignant power. Flesh was a prison. Stone churches were monuments to deception. Icons were lies carved into wood. Only the word mattered. Scripture stripped of ritual. Faith without intermediaries. They met in houses, in forests, in ravines where the wind carried sound away before it could betray them. There were no priests as the empire understood them, only teachers who memorized the gospel and spoke it quietly, without adornment. Baptism was spiritual, communion was inward, authority was poison. For a time, they survived unnoticed, but a faith that refuses hierarchy is intolerable to hierarchy. Accusations came swiftly, and with them, terror. Byzantine chroniclers wrote that the Paulicians swore oaths and blood, that they slit veins and mixed their lifeblood in shared cups. They claimed infants were sacrificed, that bodies were dismembered in secret rites, that Christ himself was mocked as illusion. These stories spread faster than any army, justifying what followed: massacres. Entire communities were put to the sword. Men, women, children, no distinction was made once the word Paulician was spoken. Villages were burned and salted. Survivors were dragged before courts, where confession meant death and denial meant torture. Their own writings were destroyed, so completely that not a single uncontested Paulician text survives. And yet, they did not disappear. Each time the empire declared them eradicated, reports surfaced of new communities forming elsewhere, in the Taurus Mountains, across the Euphrates, later, far to the west, under different names, carrying the same dangerous ideas. It was as if the faith itself refused burial. This is where the mystery deepens and certainty begins to rot. Every description of Paulician blood rituals comes from their executioners. No physical evidence of sacrifice has ever been uncovered. No burial sites revealing mass ritual death. No neutral witnesses. Only accusations preserved by those who benefited from their annihilation. So why the obsession with blood? Some historians believe the stories were deliberate inventions, drawing on ancient fears of secret cults to dehumanize dissenters. Others suggest that symbolic language speaking of spiritual death, of dying to the flesh, was twisted into literal horror by hostile ears. Still others whisper that there may have been rites so radical, so deliberately hidden, that even memory refused to hold them. What is certain is that the Paulicians frightened the empire not with violence, but with refusal. They would not bow. They would not participate. They would not recognize the authority of bishops, emperors, or councils to an empire built on order. This was contagion. In the 9th century, the response escalated. Thousands were executed in coordinated purges. Rivers reportedly ran red. Though such language may itself be metaphor sharpened into terror, survivors fled eastward, where some allied with Muslim rulers not out of shared belief, but shared enemy. This alone sealed their reputation as traitors in Christian memory. Yet even then, they endured. Their ideas resurfaced generations later. Among the Bogomils, the Cathars, and other so-called heresies that spread like cracks through medieval Europe. Each time, the same pattern repeated: accusation, blood, silence. What haunts historians is not simply that the Paulicians were destroyed, but that they were never allowed to speak for themselves. Their entire identity is constructed from records and sermons designed to condemn. We do not know their prayers. We do not know their songs. We do not even know how they describe their own God. We are left with a shape cut out of history, an absence filled with fear. Perhaps the blood stories say more about the empire than the accused. Perhaps the true covenant that bound the Paulicians was not sanguine, but spiritual, a vow to remain unknown, even unto death, a refusal to let faith be conscripted. In the end, the Paulicians dissolve into shadow, their covenant sealed not by ritual, but by erasure. They survive only as a warning written by their enemies. That belief ungoverned is more dangerous than any army, and so the question lingers, unresolved and quietly accusatory. When all testimony comes from those who held the blade, where does truth go to hide? They prayed when the world slept. When lamps were dimmed and voices softened into dreams, their candles were lit, and the sound of cloth brushing stone became the only language allowed. In a land where faith was meant to shine, these women chose shadow, and in doing so, they frightened the church that claimed to shepherd them. In the 6th century, when Gaul was still learning how to be Christian, monasteries multiplied like quiet fortresses across the countryside. The rules that governed men were written clearly enough, but for women, devotion existed in a gray and vulnerable space. Authority was inconsistent, oversight was distant, and into that uncertainty, a convent emerged whose practices unsettled even the most hardened bishops. They were said to wear black veils at all hours, heavy fabric that swallowed the face and erased the outline of the body. The veil was never lifted, not in prayer, not in sleep, not even in death. To be seen, they believed, was to be tempted. To be known was to risk corruption. They called their way of life the Black Rule, and it was whispered that once taken, it could not be undone. The convent stood on the edge of marshland, where fog gathered low and the ground itself seemed unsure whether it belonged to earth or water. No bells marked the hours. No hymns escaped the walls. Their prayers were silent, their psalms mouthed but never voiced. As if sound itself might crack the sanctity they were building inward. Their devotion centered not on Christ's life, nor even on his suffering upon the cross, but on what followed the long, silent hours in the tomb. They believed that true holiness could only be reached by dwelling where God himself had been, absent, by learning to pray in abandonment. Light was avoided, food was rationed, speech was restricted to gestures and written marks that were burned immediately after use. Initiation into the order was not gentle. Chroniclers mention rites that resembled burial more than baptism. Novices were wrapped in linen and lowered into stone chambers beneath the convent floor. There they remained for hours, sometimes days, in darkness so complete that even breath felt like an intrusion. The purpose, the abbess claimed, was to teach the soul how to endure death before it arrived. Some emerged changed, quiet, hollow-eyed, obedient beyond question. Others did not emerge at all. When deaths occurred, they were recorded without alarm. The abbess described them as consummations, as vows fulfilled rather than lives lost. The church hesitated to intervene, to aggressively risk condemning what might be sanctity. To ignore it risked allowing something unholy to grow unchecked. Visitors who were permitted inside reported narrow cells where women could neither stand nor fully lie down, forcing the body into constant discomfort. Fasting was relentless. Hair was never cut, never seen. Faces disappeared behind layers of Cloth until individuality itself seemed to dissolve. Even names were used sparingly, spoken only when absolutely necessary, and then there were the cells that never opened again. Excavations centuries later revealed sealed chambers beneath the ruins, some containing skeletal remains curled into fetal positions. No signs of struggle, no evidence of force. The doors had been closed from the inside. Whether these women entered willingly or were entombed by command remains unanswered. Rumors began to circulate among nearby villages. Shepherds claimed they heard chanting beneath the earth at dusk. Travelers reported a feeling of suffocation when passing the common walls, as if something inside was pressing outward. Mothers warned their daughters not to stare too long at the veiled sisters when they passed through town, lest their gaze be returned and something taken with it. Eventually, a synod declared the order dissolved. The ruling was careful, almost apologetic. No explicit heresy was named. No crimes were listed. The sisters were instructed to disperse, to integrate into other convents, to soften their practices. Some complied, others vanished. The convent itself was abandoned rather than reclaimed. Its stones were left to moss and silence. No relics were preserved, no saints named. It was as if the church wished to forget the place entirely. What remains most unsettling is not what the veiled sisters did, but what they sought. In a world where women's holiness was often defined by visibility, by obedience, service, and spectacle, they chose erasure. They pursued a devotion so inward that it bordered on disappearance. Whether this was liberation or captivity depends on whose voice is allowed to speak. But their voices are gone. No confessions survive. No personal writings, only the fearful descriptions of outsiders and the mute testimony of stone. Were they mystics carving out a space beyond male authority, or victims of a theology that sanctified self-negation? Did they choose the darkness, or were they taught to fear the light? The ruins do not answer. At night, when fog creeps across the marsh and settles low, the ground around the convent still sinks slightly underfoot, as if hollowed by forgotten chambers. Wind moves through broken arches and carries no sound that can be named. Only the sense that something once prayed here so fiercely it burned itself out. The veiled sisters sought God in absence, holiness in concealment, salvation in being unseen. And in doing so, they left behind one of the most troubling legacies of medieval faith, the possibility that devotion, when pushed far enough inward, becomes indistinguishable from vanishing. Their candles are long extinguished. Their veils have rotted into dust, but the question they leave behind lingers, heavy and unresolved, like breath held long in the dark. When faith demands that you disappear, is it asking for surrender or for death? They believed time itself was a lie, not a river flowing forward, not a wheel turning endlessly, but a thin curtain drawn across human sight. Behind it, they said, the truth waited in changing, patient, already complete, history, calendars, anniversaries. Even memory were distractions meant to keep humanity asleep. For those who called themselves the children of the last apostle, waking meant stepping outside of time altogether. They appeared quietly in the hills and villages of early medieval Syria, during centuries when the land itself felt suspended. Between empires and revelations, Christianity had taken root, Islam was rising, and ancient traditions still breathed beneath both. It was an age of prophets and counter-prophets, of voices claiming divine urgency. Amid this chorus, the children spoke softly, if at all. Their belief was simple and terrifying. The apostolic age had never ended. One of the 12, they said, had not died, but remained hidden by God, wandering the earth unseen until humanity was ready to hear the final word. All scripture was unfinished, all authority provisional. To organize faith, they believed, was to interrupt revelation itself. Because of this, they rejected nearly everything that bound ordinary life together. Marriage was forbidden not because it was sinful, but because it anchored the soul to a future that did not exist. Children were rare among them, and when they were born, they were not named in the customary sense. Names, like dates, were markers of time. Instead, initiates were given numbers, which shifted as the community changed, erasing permanence even in identity. They kept no written records. To write was to trap truth in sequence. Prophecy was spoken quietly, passed mouth to ear, and forgotten once fulfilled or unfulfilled. Memory itself was considered a temptation, a way of clinging to what God had already moved beyond. Outsiders struggled to understand them, and perhaps that was by design. Christian chroniclers described them as unsettlingly calm, almost detached, as if they were watching the world from a distance just beyond reach. Islamic scholars mentioned them briefly as a curious sect that refused to declare allegiance to any revealed law, yet did not openly oppose it either. What drew fear was not what they did, but what they refused to do. They would not swear oaths. They would not recognize religious courts. They paid taxes inconsistently, sometimes not at all, claiming that systems built on future obligation were irrelevant. They owned little, but not in the visible poverty of monks. Their homes were clean, orderly, and temporary, as if ready to be abandoned at a moment's notice. And then, just as quietly as they appeared, they vanished. The first reports came from Christian sources in the 9th century. Entire settlements associated with the children were found empty, cooking fires cold, tools left where they lay, no signs of struggle, no bodies, just absence, sudden and total. Some claimed the communities had fasted themselves into death, withdrawing food and water in preparation for a predicted unveiling of the apostle. Others believed they had simply walked away, dispersing into deserts and mountains until they dissolved into anonymity. Muslim accounts from the same period echo the mystery. Villages once known for their strange inhabitants ceased to exist, their names fading from local maps within a generation. Travelers passing through former settlements reported an unsettling stillness, as if the air itself had been left unfinished. What happened to the children of the last apostle remains unresolved, and perhaps intentionally so. There are darker rumors, preserved only in hostile texts, whispers of collective rituals timed to celestial signs, where entire communities prepared for what they believed would be the lifting of the world's final veil. Some sources claim mass fasting. Others speak of night journeys into the desert from which no one returned. But these accounts are vague, burdened with fear and speculation. Impossible to verify. No graves have ever been definitively linked to them, no martyrdoms recorded, no executions listed. This absence troubles historians more than violence would. Movements are usually erased through force. These people seem to have erased themselves. Why? Perhaps they believed that to be found by history was already a failure, that remembrance was another form of attachment. To be written about was to be pinned in time, fossilized by narrative. If the apostle was truly still alive, truly waiting, then survival did not matter, only readiness. In this light, disappearance becomes not tragedy, but fulfillment. The children did not seek to convert the world. They waited for it to be ready. They did not fight persecution. They stepped aside from it. Their greatest act of faith may have been their refusal to leave a trace, and yet, something of them lingers in the margins. Medieval writers occasionally reference a unnamed group who claimed revelation was incomplete, who dismissed both church and mosque as premature conclusions. Ideas similar to the children's beliefs resurface centuries later in mystical traditions that speak of hidden saints, wandering figures who sustain the world unseen. Whether these are echoes or coincidences cannot be known. The land itself seems to remember them more than texts do. In parts of Syria, local legends tell of people who walked out of the days, who learned how to leave time behind, ruined, foundations with no associated stories, paths that lead nowhere and end abruptly, as if travelers simply stopped walking at dusk, when shadows stretch and the sense of sequence loosens. It is easy to imagine the children still moving just beyond perception, not dead, not alive as we understand it, simply elsewhere, waiting with a patience that defies clocks. Their mystery challenges a quiet assumption we rarely question, that faith seeks entrance, legacy, continuation. The children of the last apostle believed the opposite, that truth does not need witnesses, that completion requires disappearance, that the final revelation would arrive not with trumpets, but with silence. And so they stepped out of the story. No hymns remain, no confessions, no apologies, only a question that history cannot answer, because it was never meant to. If revelation is unfinished, if time itself is a veil, then perhaps the children were not lost at all. Perhaps they simply arrived early and left before the rest of the world noticed the door had opened. In the northern reaches of Europe, where the winter sun barely touched the earth and the wind howled like a restless spirit through the pine and birch, there existed a cult that revered what had already been lost. They called themselves the Ash Keepers, and their devotion was to memory itself, memory of gods that no longer walked openly among men, gods whose temples had been razed by missionaries and kings. To consume ashes was to commune with the vanished, to taste the remnants of divinity that survived only in soot and ember. It was the 8th century, and Christianity had begun its slow, relentless march into Scandinavia. Yet the old ways were stubborn, etched into the bones of the land and the hearts of its people. The ash keepers gathered at night, in hollows and glades, carrying urns filled with powder from burnt shrines. The ash was mixed into bread, baked into cakes, inhaled in smoke. Each mouthful, each breath, became communion with what had been destroyed. This was not mere ritual, it was survival disguised as worship. Church records accused them of acts darker than devotion. Fires broke out in villages where the ash keepers were suspected of gathering. Children disappeared, livestock perished. The clergy called them witches, heretics, enemies of God, and chroniclers wrote as though the smoke itself whispered blasphemy. Yet no bodies were ever found, no ritual killing confirmed, only the lingering embers of suspicion, the charred remains of what might have been. They carved symbols into door frames, spirals scorched into wood, patterns no scholar has been able to explain. No creed survived, no scripture was preserved. Theirs was a faith built not on text, but on the tactile, on what could be consumed and absorbed, a religion written in ashes rather than letters. Pilgrims who stumbled upon their gatherings reported seeing figures in blackened cloaks, kneeling before nothing visible, muttering prayers only the wind could carry. Persecution came, as it always does when devotion defies order. Soldiers burned homes, and yet survivors always fled into forests and fjords, carrying their urns of ash. When they vanished, it was as if the earth itself conspired to hide them. Even today, archaeologists uncover charred structures whose purpose is unclear. Traces of communities that lived, worshipped, and disappeared without leaving behind names or records. Some historians speculate that the ash keepers were preserving the old gods through symbolic survival, using ritual fire and ash to maintain continuity in a world being overwritten by new belief. Others whisper that their practices were a form of rebellion, so subtle and patient it was almost invisible, a protest against the erasure of culture itself. The most haunting aspect of their legacy is its ambiguity. Ash is evidence and absence, presence and erasure. What remains are whispers of ritual, scorch marks on wood, and the memory of devotion that refused to die even when the world demanded it. In the long, frozen nights, one can imagine them still kneeling among smoke and ember, tasting the past, preserving it in silence. The flames have long cooled. The gods they honored are silent, and yet the ash remembers. Memory lingers where faith cannot die, waiting patiently like the slow, inevitable drift of winter snow across the northern hills. In this quiet, the ash keepers teach a lesson older than scripture, that devotion does not always seek the world's recognition, that preservation can be a prayer, and that sometimes the most powerful faith is the one that burns itself into absence, leaving only scent, shadow, and a question no eye can answer. The Bogomils moved like shadows through the valleys and plains of Bulgaria, leaving behind nothing but whispers and unease. They believed the world itself was a prison, a trap fashioned not by God, but by a deceiver, a dark architect whose work pervaded every stone and every breath. Flesh, they said, was a chain. Matter was corruption. Only the spirit could glimpse truth. Their faith was simple, terrifying, an invisible quiet refusal to obey the structures that sought to bind them. It was the 10th century, and the Balkans were a patchwork of competing authorities, armies, and churches. Christianity was asserting itself, yet the Bogomils rejected its hierarchy, its sacraments, its outward signs of devotion. They gathered in homes hidden between hills, in forest clearings, in abandoned stone towers. There were no priests among them as the church understood them, only elders who carried scripture in memory, reciting it quietly and selectively. Their rituals were silent, or so subtle that outsiders could scarcely perceive them. Church authorities accused them of horrors, ritual murders, sexual orgies, secret communions steeped in blood. Chroniclers painted them as heretics so depraved that even the imagination struggled to keep pace. But no physical evidence has ever been confirmed. No bones, no bloodstains, no instruments of execution. All that survives are the accusations themselves, a shadow cast by fear and the need to control. Persecution was relentless. Imperial armies descended upon villages, burning homes, dragging inhabitants into courts where confession meant death and defiance meant torture. Many were executed, but the faith did not die. Those who survived fled, carrying their ideas into distant lands, reshaping themselves under new names, finding refuge in secrecy. Over centuries, their influence rippled outward, seeding later movements such as the Cathars in southern France. The Bogomils' true mysteries lie in what they refused to reveal. They left no text of their own. They spoke only when necessary, and even then, only to those they trusted. Their theology was oral, fragile, and ephemeral, designed to vanish should the wrong ears listen. In doing so, they created a faith that could not be fully known, only sensed a whisper beneath the din of a world eager to condemn. They practiced asceticism, rejecting marriage and wealth, emphasizing spiritual purity above all else. Yet their greatest power may have been subtle, the refusal to participate, the decision to withdraw from a world they considered false. By stepping outside the empire's reach, they became untouchable in a way armies and courts could not fully comprehend. Time has not illuminated them. We know them only through the lens of accusation, fear, and legend, and in that, the Bogomils endure as a question. How much of faith is preserved when it survives only in absence? How powerful is belief when it refuses to be seen, when it exists as shadow, as silence, as resistance, and still, if one walks through the valleys where they once gathered, where wind whistles through abandoned stones, it is possible to imagine them there, kneeling quietly, eyes closed, spirit unbound, preserving a truth that no empire could ever extinguish. In the shadows, the Bogomils wait not as monsters, not as saints, but as witnesses to a faith that refused to be owned, a devotion that lived in the spaces the world forgot. The Messalians prayed until the boundaries between body and spirit dissolved, until devotion became delirium and delirium became devotion. In the cities and villages of 4th and 5th century Mesopotamia, they were whispered about in fear, chronicled with suspicion, and condemned with zeal. Their name, derived from the word for prayer, belied the extremity of their practice, not mere supplication, but a relentless, all-consuming insistence that the soul could be freed from demons. Only through unending vigil, the world around them was one of rigid hierarchy. Bishops, patriarchs, and councils demanded obedience and ritual. Yet the Messalians, known also as the Eukites, rejected all such structures. Authority, they claimed, was a cage, sacraments, a veil. They sought an intimate and unmediated communion with God, one that could be achieved only through fervent, ceaseless prayer. Their devotion was physical as much as spiritual postures of prostration that left bones aching, movements that blurred into ecstatic dance, and chants so prolonged they became indistinguishable from the howling wind. The church accused them of terrible things. Chroniclers wrote that Messalians engaged in illicit rites, that they allowed demons to enter others to exorcise them, that their gatherings became chaotic spectacles of flesh and spirit intertwined. Pilgrims and officials described visions of thrashing bodies, convulsions that seemed at once pious and profane, eyes rolling back, lips whispering incomprehensible words. Some claimed that the Messalians' devotion drove them mad, while others argued that madness was a veil to shield their most sacred secrets. Persecution was swift and severe. Synods condemned them, rulers expelled them, and yet the movement persisted, scattering quietly across Anatolia, Armenia, and Syria. Wherever they fled, stories followed, communities disrupted, neighbors unsettled, rumors of unearthly fervor spreading like a contagion. Unlike many heretical movements, the Messalians did not organize for survival. They were small, dispersed, almost impossible to trace. Their power was not in armies or texts, but in the intensity of the individual's devotion to devotion, so consuming it could reshape mind and body alike. The mystery that surrounds them is profound. Were they deluded zealots, victims of their own ecstatic practices? Or were they pioneers of a spiritual intimacy so extreme that it was incomprehensible to outsiders? Their teachings survive only in condemnations and warnings, fragments filtered through the lens of fear. We cannot know their prayers, their visions, the rhythms of breath and motion that form the core of their practice. Even today, when desert winds sweep across the ruins of ancient monasteries and towns, it is easy to imagine their shadows moving among the stones, whispering to spirits we cannot see, praying in ways the world has forgotten. Their legacy is not in texts or monuments, but in the haunting question of devotion itself. How far can faith go before it becomes unrecognizable? And at what point does surrender to the divine become surrender to something darker? The Messalians do not ask for our understanding. They ask only that we remember that faith, in its most extreme form, may be indistinguishable from madness, and that the line between holy vision and perilous obsession is a line only the soul can measure. even in silence, even in absence. There, prayer seemed to linger unheard by most, but echoing eternally in the spaces where devotion exceeds comprehension, in the stillness where the spirit chooses to speak alone. In the dense forests and hidden glades of medieval Europe, there emerged a group whose faith was both audacious and unsettling, the Adamites. They believed that the world could be returned to its primordial innocence, that mankind had once walked in perfect harmony with creation, unburdened by shame, law, or even clothing. To reclaim this state was to embrace purity in its most literal form, to shed every human convention that separated them from God. It was the early Middle Ages, a time when kingdoms were consolidating, when laws and customs were as rigid as the stones of fortified cities. Christianity was expanding its reach, teaching modesty, obedience, and the sanctity of ritual. And yet, among forests and remote clearings, the Adamites gathered, naked, vulnerable, and defiant. Their ceremonies were clandestine, held under the shadow of trees where sunlight dappled the earth like scattered gold. No priest oversaw their rites. No scripture dictated their movement. Only the conviction that innocence could be restored through absolute surrender. Chroniclers of the time recorded these gatherings with horror and fascination. They wrote of men and women walking unclothed through meadows, dancing in circles, their hands raised to the sky as if to touch the heavens themselves. They were said to sing in voices raw with devotion, echoing ancient melodies long forgotten, creating harmonies that were both terrifying and beautiful. To outsiders, their ceremony seemed chaotic, a blasphemous mockery of human order. To the Adamites, it was a reclamation of literal and spiritual rebirth. Authorities moved quickly against them. Knights and clergy descended upon villages suspected of harboring Adamites. Fires were set, participants beaten or driven into exile. Yet despite relentless persecution, the movement persisted, resurfacing under new names and in distant forests. Rumors of their practices traveled faster than armies, stirring fear among rulers who could not fathom a devotion so radical that it rejected social and religious hierarchies entirely. The mystery of the Adamites lies not in their actions alone, but in the reasoning behind them. Were they libertines cloaked in religious justification, or mystics striving toward a divine ideal? Did their nakedness signify rebellion, or an unshakable desire to emulate humanity's first innocence? No text remained to clarify their intentions, only the frightened testimonies of those who sought to suppress them. Even centuries later, in the quiet of early morning forests, one can imagine the Adamites' chants rising with the mist, ephemeral and untouchable. Their legacy is not one of records or monuments, but of questions that endure. What is purity? What is devotion, and how far can faith stretch before it becomes indistinguishable from transgression? In this haunting silence, the Adamites leave us a chilling reflection that the pursuit of spiritual perfection may demand the abandonment of everything the world holds sacred, and that sometimes, to approach God, one must strip away not only clothing but the very expectations of society, standing naked before the infinite and unanswerable. The air across Europe was thick with fear when the plague began to devour villages, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. And yet, in that shadow of death, a group rose whose devotion was as extreme as the disease itself. They called themselves the Flagellants, and their worship was a symphony of pain, their prayers written not in words, but in the blood that streamed from their own backs. It was the 14th century, and the Black Death had turned cities into tombs, filled streets with despair, and left churches echoing with empty pleas. Faith wavered. Prayer seemed unanswered. In this atmosphere of panic and mortality, the Flagellants marched. They moved in processions from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, the sound of leather striking flesh mingling with the desperate murmur of the crowd. Their belief was clear. God's wrath could be appeased through suffering, and only by showing the depths of human pain could the plague be halted. Chroniclers wrote in awe and horror of their gatherings. Entire communities would gather to watch, the air heavy with the coppery scent of blood. Men and women, stripped of modesty, knelt upon the cobblestones, striking themselves rhythmically, chanting prayers in voices strained with ecstasy and exhaustion. Children sometimes watched from doorways, wide-eyed, learning both fear and reverence. It was both spectacle and ritual, devotion intertwined with a display of power over the body's limits. The church was initially ambivalent. At first, the Flagellants were tolerated, even encouraged, as a sign of collective penitence. But as the processions grew, moving across regions and inspiring riots and unrest, The hierarchy grew uneasy. The Pope eventually condemned them, declaring their acts heretical. Soldiers were sent to disperse them, churches excommunicated those who participated. And yet the movement persisted. They did not rely on doctrine or hierarchy. Their authority came from the spectacle of suffering itself. The most unsettling aspect was their paradoxical power. By embracing pain, they became untouchable in a way armies and governments could not fully contain. Towns cowered before them, and yet no one could say precisely what they worshipped. Was it God, the fear of God, or the human body made holy through suffering? Reports vary. Some said they invited plague into their midst voluntarily, believing that exposure purified the soul. Others claimed that their self-inflicted wounds glowed faintly in moonlight, a sign of divine favor or curse. Where the flagellants walked, fear and reverence followed. And when persecution finally broke them, when the processions dwindled and soldiers burned their makeshift crosses, the memory remained. Villagers swore that at night, even after the movement was gone, faint sounds of whipping could be heard carried by the wind, echoing through empty streets. The flagellants leave behind a haunting question. What is devotion? When it demands the body itself as sacrifice, can faith endure beyond comfort, beyond reason, beyond safety? They remind us that terror and holiness are sometimes inseparable, that extreme times can give rise to extreme piety, and that the echo of devotion can linger long after the last voice has been silenced. In the silent villages, under the blackened sky, one can still imagine them moving slowly in endless procession, their backs red, their voices broken yet unwavering, praying not for themselves, but for a world they could not save, an offering. Their suffering is a testament to a faith that knew no limit. In the mist-shrouded valleys of northern Italy, where fog clung to the mountains like a shroud and rivers whispered through deserted villages, there emerged a cult so secretive that the very sound of their name was enough to summon suspicion. The flagellants had passed, but now came the fraticelli, the Little Brothers, a movement whose devotion was both ascetic and apocalyptic. They claimed the church had lost its way, that corruption had seeped into every stone and sermon, and that salvation required more than prayer. It required withdrawal, penance, and a refusal to touch the world as it had become. It was the late 13th century, a time when papal authority was at its height, and heresy was not merely a spiritual failing, but a political threat. The fraticelli rejected the hierarchy that the church demanded. Wealth, property, even standard sacraments were tainted. They wandered in small bands, barefoot and ragged, surviving on meager alms, preaching an austere faith to those willing to listen and denouncing those unwilling. Chroniclers describe them as frighteningly zealous, their eyes sharp with conviction, their hands calloused not from labor, but from years of rigorous self-discipline. Their gatherings were nearly invisible. Meetings occurred in forests, abandoned chapels, or caves carved into cliffs. Their prayers were whispered, punctuated by silence, often lasting hours without movement or sound. They fasted constantly, sometimes until their bodies were wasted and trembling. Flesh, they believed, was a chain, a temptation to pride, and a vessel of sin. Their goal was not comfort or recognition, but purity. Persecution followed swiftly. Papal bulls denounced them as heretics, armies were dispatched to seize their communities, and inquisitions hunted them relentlessly. Yet the fraticelli were elusive. They traveled lightly, leaving no permanent structures, no enduring signs of their passage. Entire villages claimed to have hosted them for months, yet when authorities arrived, the brothers had vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. Legends tell of their most extreme practices: mortification of the flesh through chains and whipping, sleeping on stone floors with only rags for cover, and fasting that lasted weeks. Some chroniclers hint at secretive rituals in which the fraticelli would symbolically strip themselves of worldly attachments, casting aside clothing, property, and even names, taking on new identities as proof of devotion. But these reports come from those who feared them, and may be exaggeration or invention. What remains haunting is not only the secrecy of the fraticelli, but their disappearance. Where armies sought to destroy them, the evidence of their existence was nearly erased. Stories persisted only through fearful whispers, reports of footprints in snow that led to nowhere, of faces glimpsed briefly in twilight, of prayers carried faintly on the wind. Their devotion left no material trace, only the echo of unwavering faith. In the deep quiet of Italian valleys, when moonlight spills across stones and fog drifts low, it is possible to imagine them moving silently, praying in shadows, their bodies bent with fasting, their voices nearly drowned by the wind. Their legacy is a question left unanswered. What is the measure of true devotion? Is it obedience, endurance, or invisibility? The Fraticelli suggests another possibility that faith might be strongest when it is entirely hidden, when the world does not see it, and when the soul alone bears witness to its own relentless pursuit of purity. And in that shadowed pursuit, they remain unseen, unheard, yet present. A reminder that devotion can demand more than life itself, and that some faiths are so extreme, so intimate, that the world can never fully grasp them, even as it trembles. In recognition, in the shadowed hills of Bohemia, where dense forests pressed against crumbling stone castles, and rivers wound like silver knives through the valleys, a sect emerged whose devotion was as mesmerizing as it was terrifying, the Taborites. They believed that the end of the world was imminent, that heaven and earth would collide in a fiery reckoning, and that only by rejecting the corrupt world and embracing radical equality could salvation be attained. It was the early 15th century, a time of turmoil. The Hussite movement had begun to challenge the Catholic Church's authority in Prague and beyond, and voices demanding reform were rising like the tide against immovable cliffs. The Taborites were its most extreme branch, named after the fortified town of Tabor, which became both refuge and citadel. Within its walls, hierarchy was discarded. All men and women were deemed equal. Property was communal. Food was shared. And faith was absolute. Their devotion was a living, breathing system, demanding not only belief, but action, endurance, and the willingness to confront death itself. Chroniclers painted vivid, fearful pictures of their practices. They trained for battle with the same intensity they trained in prayer. Armed with crossbows and pikes, they marched in ranks that mirrored their religious processions, chanting scripture and psalms as they prepared to confront not merely armies, but the very corruption they saw festering in the church. Their rituals included fasting, public confessions, and intense periods of meditation designed to purify mind and body alike. Some claimed that they invoked visions of Christ himself guiding their actions, while others whispered that the line between divine inspiration and fanaticism had long since blurred. Outside observers often conflated fear with fact. Stories circulated of Taborites conducting secretive ceremonies under the cover of night, of sacred fire purifying both body and soul, of punishments enacted upon those who faltered in their devotion. While much of this was likely exaggeration, the fear they inspired was real. Armies hesitated, bishops trembled, and nobles hesitated to enter the Taborite stronghold for fear of spiritual and physical retribution. What remains most haunting is the mixture of idealism and violence. The Taborites were not merely rebels, they were visionaries convinced of their role in God's plan. Yet that vision demanded sacrifice, sometimes of life, sometimes of comfort, sometimes of morality itself. Their greatest victories were not measured in conquest, but in the endurance of faith under siege, the survival of devotion against impossible odds. Even after the fall of Tabor, their influence endured. Legends tell of wandering Taborite preachers, still carrying the memory of communal purity, still whispering of the coming apocalypse, still inspiring both fear and awe. Their cities may have crumbled, their armies dispersed, but the idea of living wholly for divine will, unshackled by hierarchy or wealth, lingered in the imagination of Europe. In the fog-laden hills where their walls once rose, one can almost hear their chants carried faintly on the wind, a rhythm of hope and terror intertwined. They remind us that devotion can be revolutionary, that faith can demand courage equal to that of a soldier and focus equal to that of a hermit. And in the stillness of night, when the hills are silent except for the whisper of leaves, it is possible to feel their presence, a lingering testament to a people who believed that salvation required nothing less than complete surrender, both of self and of world. The Taborites leave us with a question that echoes through centuries. What is the cost of unwavering faith, and how far must one go when belief demands not merely obedience, but the very shaping of reality itself? Even in absence, even in defeat, their devotion whispers through the forests of Bohemia, unextinguished and eternal. In the frozen reaches of northern Germany, where mist clung to thatched roofs and the blackened forests seemed to breathe with secrets, there emerged a sect whose devotion was whispered about with dread, the Brethren of the Free Spirit. Their faith was a radical assertion that the soul, unshackled by sin or church authority, could act freely, beyond law and ritual, and that union with God could be achieved in life itself, not through intercession, penance, or scripture, but through the daring abandonment of earthly constraint. It was the late 13th century. a time when rigid hierarchies governed both church and secular life. Kings ruled with sword and decree, bishops oversaw every aspect of faith, and the common people learned to fear what they did not understand. Into this world stepped the free-spirit believers, often women and men in equal measure, moving quietly through villages, forests, and towns, preaching an audacious message. The soul could be perfected on earth, unbound by sin, law, or clerical authority. Church records describe them with alarm and fascination. They were said to renounce property, marriage, and even modesty, living itinerantly and adopting a radical equality that unsettled the rigid social order. Some chroniclers claimed that they engaged in sexual acts as forms of devotion, not for pleasure, but as manifestations of divine union. Though whether these accounts are true or exaggerations by fearful clergy is impossible to discern, what remains certain is that their practices challenged everything medieval society held sacred. They gathered in secret, often in the ruins of chapels abandoned to decay, or in hidden clearings where the wind carried no rumor to prying ears. Their rituals were ecstatic, blending prayer, dance, and meditation into forms so fluid that outsiders could not follow them. Members were said to walk among the towns, silent yet radiant, their eyes reflecting the audacity of belief that dared to place human will in direct communion with God. Persecution came quickly. Papal bulls condemned the movement as heresy. Bishops excommunicated members. Soldiers and inquisitors descended upon communities suspected of harboring the free spirit. Yet the sect was elusive. They dissolved into the forests, reappearing elsewhere. With the same fervor, their teachings preserved orally, their faith living in whispers and subtle gestures rather than written word. The Brethren's greatest mystery lies not in their survival, but in their disappearance. No lasting texts remain. Their true rituals, their prayers, the exact methods by which they sought union with the divine all vanished, leaving only fearful chronicles and rumor. It is as if the sect itself understood that true freedom, true devotion, cannot be captured on parchment or stone, that it must exist fleetingly, alive in the soul. Even today, in the forest of Saxony and Thuringia, the wind twists through the trees as though carrying faint echoes of the free spirit's chants. Travelers claim to feel eyes upon them in the fog, fleeting glimpses of figures moving silently, unbound by the world. Their legacy is a question as unsettling as it is profound. Can faith exist entirely for itself, without structure, without recognition, without permanence? And in that question lies the haunting truth the brethren of the free spirit leave behind. That devotion may demand freedom so absolute it vanishes from the world entirely, and yet, in absence, it can continue to stir, invisible and eternal, in the spaces where belief surpasses comprehension, in the remote valleys of medieval France, where mist clung to the stone walls of abandoned abbeys and the forest seemed alive with whispered secrets. There emerged a movement so enigmatic that it haunted both peasant and prelate alike. The Cathars, known to some as the Pure Ones, their faith was a radical inversion of the world around them, a belief that creation itself was a lie, a prison fashioned by a corrupt deity, and not only by rejecting flesh, worldly authority, and the Church's sacraments could the soul glimpse the true light. It was the 12th century, and southern France was a tapestry of warring lords, bustling markets, and the ever-present influence of Rome. The Cathars thrived in this liminal space. Their communities built on the edges of mountains and along hidden valleys, where control was weaker and rumor more potent than decree. To join them was to embrace both asceticism and defiance. Men and women renounced property, marriage, and violence, striving for a spiritual purity that transcended the physical world. Their ultimate aim was the consolamentum, a ritual of baptism, by the laying on of hands, which they believed purified the soul entirely and freed it from the cycle of birth and sin. Chroniclers and inquisitors wrote of them with horror, describing ceremonies in which the body was subdued, the spirit exalted, and the community bound in secrecy. Tales spread at gatherings in which participants fasted to near death, spent nights in prayer, and spoke only in whispers lest worldly corruption taint their devotion. The Church labeled them heretics, painting their beliefs as both seductive and dangerous, insisting that their rejection of sacraments and hierarchy was a direct attack on God Himself. Persecution followed swiftly and mercilessly. Crusades were launched, armies marched through valleys where the Cathars had gathered, and towns were besieged with the precision of holy wrath. Survivors were executed, burned at the stake, or dispersed. And yet the faith persisted in whispers and memory. Their doctrines were preserved orally, their communities rebuilt in secret, always just out of reach of the Inquisitor's grasp. The most haunting element of the Catholic legacy is its disappearance. Their texts were destroyed, their rituals silenced, their names erased from records. What survives is fear itself, chronicles dripping with alarm, reports of martyrdom, and the charred remains of those who refuse to bend. Modern scholars can piece together their beliefs only through fragments. Yet in those fragments lies the intensity of a devotion that valued spirit over flesh, and truth over survival. Even centuries later, in the quiet of the Languedoc valleys, one can sense their presence. Stones of ruined castles seem to hum with memory. Forests carry the weight of footsteps that may no longer exist. The Cathars endure not as texts or monuments, but as questions etched into the landscape. How far can faith go when it rejects all worldly authority? How deep can devotion sink when the body itself is denied? In that silence, the pure ones whisper, still, reminding us that true faith may demand the impossible, that it can be both luminous and terrifying, and that even in erasure, devotion can leave a mark no conqueror or inquisitor can fully obliterate. The Cathar shadow lingers, eternal and unanswered, like a candle flickering in a cathedral lawn, abandoned, in the shadowed hills of Lombardy, where mist coils around the ruins of abbeys and rivers glint like silver threads through the valleys. A sect arose whose devotion was both radical and forbidden, a vigil, seeking the union of their souls with God without the intercession of worldly authority. Chroniclers and inquisitors wrote of them with equal parts fascination and dread. Some claim that the Beguines engaged in mystical practices that allowed them to communicate directly with the divine, bypassing the sacraments entirely. Others whispered of secretive meetings, of women speaking in tongues or performing acts of devotion that bordered on the ecstatic or the forbidden. Their practices challenged the church not by rebellion, but by example. They demonstrated that holiness could exist outside the sanctioned structure of power. Persecution came swiftly in waves. Papal bulls condemned them as heretics. Secular authorities sometimes expelled them, and inquisitors interrogated the most outspoken members. Yet they were resilient, adapting to persecution by scattering or hiding in plain sight. Many survived, passing down teachings orally, preserving rituals, prayers, and knowledge in ways that left almost no trace in written records. The very secrecy that the church feared became their shield. What remains haunting about the Beghards and Beguines is the paradox of their devotion. They sought absolute holiness through humility and service, yet in doing so, they became objects of fear and suspicion. Their faith demanded total commitment, but it also demanded invisibility, a life lived quietly, outside recognition, sustained by inner devotion alone. Even today, the ruins of their houses, the narrow lanes where they once walked barefoot, and the faint echoes of prayer in forgotten chapels speak to a devotion that survives in shadow. The Beghards and Beguines remind us that faith is not always measured in monuments or texts, but in the lives lived quietly, the sacrifices made unseen, and the courage to pursue holiness even when the world labels it dangerous. In the stillness of forests and towns, their presence lingers, a whisper of spiritual radicalism, eternal, unseen, and unbroken. In the remote hills of Galicia, where mist rises from the rivers like ghostly fingers and forests close in with a dark, impenetrable silence, a sect arose whose faith was as terrifying as it was secret. The Bogomils, unlike outwardly militant movements, they were subtle, invisible, yet their beliefs shook kingdoms and empires alike. They held that the material world itself was the creation of a malevolent force, a prison for the soul, and that salvation could be attained only by rejecting all worldly attachments. All church authority, and in some accounts even the sacred rites themselves. It was the 10th century, a time when Bulgaria was a land of both spiritual and political upheaval. Christianity had taken root, but pagan traditions lingered, and political borders shifted like sand under the feet of armies. The Bogomils emerged quietly among peasants, monks, and wanderers, spreading a doctrine that was radical in its simplicity. The physical world was inherently corrupt, and the spirit alone was pure. To inhabit the body was to struggle against sin. To own property was to embrace deception. To obey authority was to bow before lies. Church authorities chronicled them with alarm, describing secret gatherings in forests, remote valleys, and abandoned structures. Participants were said to meet at night, their prayers whispered, their rituals invisible to outsiders. Many accounts accused them of heresy, of mystical rites that violated the natural order. Yet no physical evidence has survived to confirm such claims. Their power lay not in violence or conquest, but in ideas so threatening that they spread fear faster than any sword could. Persecution came swiftly. Imperial and ecclesiastical forces sought to eradicate them, condemning villages, interrogating the faithful, and executing those who refused to recant. Yet the Bogomils were elusive. They dispersed, sometimes vanishing without trace, leaving only echoes of belief and whispered rumors in their wake. Communities that once followed them disappeared almost entirely from history, as though the earth itself had swallowed them. Their greatest mystery is the intensity of their devotion and the absolute secrecy they maintained. No written texts survive, no codified doctrines endure, only fragments preserved through the hostile pen of those who sought to destroy them. Yet those fragments speak of a movement that reshaped thought, influencing later heretical and mystical traditions across Europe, echoing in distant lands and centuries beyond their disappearance. Even today, in Galicia's forests, one can imagine shadows moving silently through the trees, prayer whispered under the wind sigh, a devotion hidden, yet unbroken. The Bogomils leave behind a haunting lesson that faith can exist entirely outside recognition, that ideas can endure where empires cannot, and that the spirit may wander free even when history attempts to erase it in silence and absence. There, devotion remains, eternal and untouchable, like a flame hidden beneath the snow, waiting for the world to remember what it once feared. In the dark valleys of Provence, where rocky cliffs descend sharply into mist-laden rivers and forests seem to breathe with secrets, there thrived a sect whose devotion terrified both kings and clergy, the Catholic Perfecti. Unlike ordinary believers, the Perfecti were ascetics who renounced all worldly pleasure, all possession, even the very sustenance of the body, in the pursuit of spiritual purity. To witness them was to glimpse a faith so absolute it rendered flesh nearly irrelevant and the world itself a place of temptation to be resisted at every turn. It was the 12th and 13th centuries, an era of crusades and papal authority. When southern France simmered with rebellion, heresy, and mysticism, cities were fortified, roads patrolled, and the church sought control over every aspect of life. Amid this turmoil, the Perfecti walked with a serene defiance. They did not fight with armies. Their weapons were fasting, meditation, and withdrawal from all that tethered the soul to sin. They took no oaths to kings, held no land, and often moved from village to village, their presence both inspiring and unsettling to those who encountered them. Chroniclers of the time were fascinated and horrified. They described the Perfecti as walking in silence, robes simple and unadorned, their eyes reflecting both compassion and unshakable resolve. Their rituals were austere, prolonged fasting, nights spent in prayer until the body trembled, confessions of sin repeated endlessly in the pursuit of purification, their most sacred rite. The consolamentum was a baptism of the soul, believed to release them from the cycle of reincarnation in the flesh. Those who received it were considered spiritually perfect. Yet even the uninitiated felt the weight of their presence, a gravity born of devotion so extreme it was almost unbearable to behold. Persecution soon followed. Crusaders swept through towns, burning villages suspected of harboring Catholics. Many Perfecti chose martyrdom rather than recantation, climbing to the pious with serene acceptance, their chants rising above the crackling flames. Others vanished in the forests, moving silently from place to place, preserving their faith orally, leaving no permanent traces for the Inquisitor's hand to grasp. The haunting mystery of the Perfecti lies in what remains unsaid, the depth of their inner lives, the visions that guided them, the words that passed from mouth to mouth and were never recorded. They leave us with questions rather than answers. How much can a soul endure? What is the price of purity when the world offers only corruption? Even today, in the valleys of Languedoc, one can sense the shadow of their devotion. The wind carries faint echoes of prayer, ruins hold whispers of chants, and the stones of abandoned chapels remember the weight of lives lived in absolute faith. The Perfecti remind us that devotion may demand the impossible, to surrender body, comfort, and sometimes even survival itself, in absence and silence. They endure a spectral testament to faith unbound, fierce, and eternal. In the highlands of England, where mist clung to stone keeps and wind, greatest mystery is the intensity of their devotion and the absolute secrecy they maintained. No written texts survive, no codified doctrines endure, only fragments preserved through the hostile pen of those who sought to destroy them. Yet those fragments speak of a movement that reshaped thought, influencing later heretical and mystical traditions across Europe, echoing in distant lands and centuries beyond their disappearance, even today. In Galicia's forests, one can imagine shadows, moving silently through the trees, prayer whispered under the wind's sigh, a devotion hidden yet unbroken. The Bogomils leave behind a haunting lesson that faith can exist entirely outside recognition, that ideas can endure where empires cannot, and that the spirit may wander free even when history attempts to erase it in silence and absence. There, devotion remains, eternal and untouchable, like a flame hidden beneath the snow, waiting for the world to remember what it once feared. In the dark valleys of Provence, where rocky cliffs descend sharply into mist-laden rivers and forests seem to breathe with secrets, there thrived a sect whose devotion terrified both kings and clergy, the Catholic perfecti. Unlike ordinary believers, the perfecti were ascetics who renounced all worldly pleasure, all possession, even the very sustenance of the body, in the pursuit of spiritual purity. To witness them was to glimpse a faith so absolute it rendered flesh nearly irrelevant, and the world itself a place of temptation to be resisted at every turn. It was the 12th and 13th centuries, an era of crusades and papal authority. When southern France simmered with rebellion, heresy, and mysticism, cities were fortified, roads patrolled, and the church sought control over every aspect of life. Amid this turmoil, the perfecti walked with a serene defiance. They did not fight with armies. Their weapons were fasting, meditation, and withdrawal from all that tethered the soul to sin. They took no oaths to kings, held no land, and often moved from village to village, their presence both inspiring and unsettling to those who encountered them. Chroniclers of the time were fascinated and horrified. They described the perfecti as walking in silence, robes simple and unadorned, their eyes reflecting both compassion and unshakable resolve. Their rituals were austere, prolonged fasting, nights spent in prayer until the body trembled, confessions of sin repeated endlessly in the pursuit of purification, their most sacred rite. The consolamentum was a baptism of the soul, believed to release them from the cycle of reincarnation into flesh. Those who received it were considered spiritually perfect. Yet even the uninitiated felt the weight of their presence, a gravity born of devotion so extreme it was almost unbearable to behold. Persecution soon followed. Crusaders swept through towns, burning villages suspected of harboring Catholics. Many perfecti chose martyrdom rather than recantation, climbing to the pyres with serene acceptance, their chants rising above the crackling flames. Others vanished in the forests, moving silently from place to place, preserving their faith orally, leaving no permanent traces for the inquisitor's hand to grasp. The haunting mystery of the perfecti lies in what remains unsaid, the depth of their inner lives, the visions that guided them, the words that passed from mouth to mouth and were never recorded. They leave us with questions rather than answers. How much can a soul endure? What is the price of purity when the world offers only corruption, even today? In the valleys of Languedoc, one can sense the shadow of their devotion. The wind carries faint echoes of prayer, ruins hold whispers of chants, and the stones of abandoned chapels remember the weight of lives lived in absolute faith. The perfecti remind us that devotion may demand the impossible, to surrender body, comfort, and sometimes even survival itself, in absence and silence. They endure a spectral testament to faith unbound, fierce, and eternal. In the Highlands of England, where mist clung to stone keeps and wind swept through empty moors like a mournful hymn, there arose a sect whose devotion was whispered about with both fear and awe, the Lollards. They were not warriors, nor did they build great temples. Yet their radical faith shook the foundations of church and crown alike. They preached that the word of God belonged to the people, that scripture need not be mediated by priests, and that the soul could commune directly with the divine. It was the late 14th century, a time when the English monarchy struggled to maintain authority over distant shires, and the church exerted influence over every aspect of life. The Lollards emerged quietly, often as laymen and women reading forbidden texts, interpreting scripture in ways that challenged clerical authority. They moved in secret, gathering in cottages, hidden chapels, and the recesses of monasteries long abandoned. Their devotion was both intellectual and spiritual. Study, prayer, and moral reform were intertwined, each feeding the other, each drawing them further from the church's sanctioned path. Chroniclers describe the fear they inspired in the establishment. Their meetings were small, their numbers elusive, yet their influence spread like wildfire. Sermons in the vernacular, critiques of indulgences, an insistence that confession and salvation were personal acts rather than rituals administered by priests marked them as dangerous. The church condemned them as heretics, the crown feared their influence on the common people, and many Lollards were arrested, imprisoned, or executed for refusing to recant. Those who survived moved quietly from town to town, carrying their beliefs in whispered teachings and clandestine gatherings. What remains haunting about the Lollards is the tension between their simplicity and their courage. They demanded nothing more than truth and devotion. Yet the consequences of such faith were severe. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of their meetings, of texts hidden in straw beds, of prayers offered in candlelit barns while inquisitors patrolled the streets. Their practices were invisible yet transformative, a rebellion not of sword or fire, but a conviction, even centuries later. The ruins of their meeting places and the faint echoes of Scripture in old texts bear witness to their persistence. The Lollards remind us that faith can survive outside authority, that devotion can be both quiet and radical, and that the courage to think, pray, and believe differently may leave a legacy more enduring than armies or empires. In the silence of the English moors, when the wind rustles the heather and the moon casts pale light across abandoned villages, it is possible to imagine them still, kneeling in secret, reading the Word, voices low but unbroken. Their devotion, hidden yet unshakable, lingers like a shadow across centuries, a testament to the enduring power of belief unbound by hierarchy or fear. In the forests of southern Germany, where mist wound through gnarled oaks and the sound of water over rocks carried like whispered secrets, there thrived a sect whose faith was both radical and invisible, the Brethren of the Free Spirit. There, belief was simple yet terrifying. True union with God demanded the complete renunciation of worldly law, fleshly desire, and earthly authority. To live fully in the Spirit was to move beyond sin, beyond obedience, and beyond the very boundaries of morality imposed by church or crown. It was the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a time when European monarchs consolidated power, and the church sought to assert control over every parish, town, and household. Into this rigid structure, the Brethren appeared quietly, wandering from village to village, forest to glades, preaching that the soul alone held the path to salvation. Some were women, some men. Some lived solitary lives, others gathered in small, secretive bands. They carried no texts, built no temples, and yet their influence spread in whispers, rumors of miraculous piety, ecstatic visions, and defiance so subtle it unsettled even the most devout observers. Chroniclers and inquisitors wrote with alarm. Some claimed the Brethren renounced all property, all marriage, all ordinary bonds, claiming that only in freedom from these ties could the soul achieve divine perfection. Others suggested more scandalous behavior, ecstatic rites, mystical practices that blurred the line between devotion and transgression. The truth is nearly impossible to separate from fear-driven exaggeration, but the impact is clear. Their ideas were dangerous precisely because they could not be pinned down, contained, or fully condemned. Persecution followed. Church authorities issued excommunications, inquisitors interrogated suspected members, and armies were sent to disrupt gatherings. Yet the Brethren were elusive. They vanished into forests, abandoned villages, and even the mountains, reappearing where least expected. Their faith was oral, embodied, secret, protected by silence, as much as by devotion. Where written doctrine failed, lived experience endured. What remains haunting is the intensity of their belief and the mystery of their disappearance. No texts survive, no rituals fully documented, only the echoes of fear and fascination remain. The whispered warnings in towns and villages, the faint traces and legends passed down through generations. Their devotion was radical, intimate, and entirely unconstrained by the expectations of the world. Even today, in the forests of Saxony and Thuringia, one can imagine them moving silently through mystic glades, voices low with prayer, eyes lifted to the unseen. The Brethren of the Free Spirit remind us that faith can demand absolute freedom, that devotion may thrive entirely in shadow, and that some spiritual movements leave no monument but the lingering sense of something. Both are inspiring and ineffable, in absence and silence. They endure eternal, untouchable, and profoundly mysterious. In the jagged hills of northern Italy, where fog clings to ruined abbeys and rivers wind like silver threads through dark forests, there emerged a sect whose devotion was whispered about with fear and fascination, the Flagellants of the Lombard Plains. Unlike any conventional religious order, they believed that the sins of humanity could be cleansed through pain, and not only by offering the flesh itself to divine judgment. Could God's wrath be tempered? Their rituals were extreme, their faith a storm that consumed both body and spirit. It was the 14th century, and Europe reeled under the shadow of the Black Death. Cities emptied, fields lay fallow, and the cry of death filled the air. In this time of despair, the flagellants marched. They traveled in solemn processions through villages and towns, whips in hand, chanting prayers that rose and fell like the wind through the ruined streets. Their bodies bore the evidence of devotion, welts and blood, skin broken, but spirits unbowed. To outsiders, their appearance was terrifying, almost otherworldly, a living testament to a faith that had surrendered every comfort and every boundary of flesh. Chroniclers and clergy recorded them with both awe and horror. They spoke of entire communities drawn into the rhythm of self-punishment, of nights spent in relentless prayer and vigil, of men and women moving together in synchronized devotion, their voices rising above the slap of leather on skin. Some believed the flagellants sought only to appease God. Others whispered that their practices invited the plague closer, drawing death as a sacrament itself. Fear and fascination blended, leaving a legacy of stories that were part legend, part warning. The Church's response was swift and severe. Papal bulls condemned the flagellants as heretics, soldiers disrupted their processions, and inquisitors hunted those who refused to abandon the practice. Yet despite persecution, the movement persisted, moving from region to region, leaving only footprints in mud and fleeting memories of prayers carried on the wind. Their devotion was not rooted in territory or wealth, but in the extremity, a belief that transformed suffering into sanctity. What remains most haunting is the paradox of their faith. The flagellants sought purification through violence, yet their devotion was profoundly spiritual. Their rituals blurred the line between martyrdom and ecstasy, despair and hope, fear and reverence. They left no texts, no permanent structures, only the echo of suffering made sacred and the indelible impression of a world momentarily gripped by faith so intense it was inseparable from pain itself. Even centuries later, in the fog-laden valleys and abandoned village squares, one can imagine them walking in silence, whips coiled in hand, chanting prayers whose meaning has been lost to time. Their presence lingers in the shadow of devotion, a reminder that faith can demand the unimaginable, that holiness and horror may coexist in the same act, and that some echoes of belief, born in suffering, endure long after the bodies that carried them have vanished. The flagellants leave us with a question that resonates through the ages. How far will the human spirit go in pursuit of divine favor? And what traces remain when devotion is expressed not in words or buildings, but in the fragile, bleeding flesh of those willing to surrender everything? Even in absence, even in silence, their legacy persists haunting, unyielding, and eternal. In the rugged hills of Bohemia, where fog rolls down the valleys like a living shroud and forests seem to hold their breath, there arose a sect whose faith was whispered with awe and dread, the Taborites of Tabor. Unlike ordinary believers, their devotion demanded a life reshaped entirely by faith. They rejected hierarchy, refused worldly possession, and embraced a militant devotion to spiritual equality. To witness them was to glimpse a society where God's law alone governed, and where the temporal world, with its kings and priests, was nothing more than a shadow of corruption. It was the early 15th century, and Europe was a land of upheaval. The Hussite movement had erupted in Bohemia, challenging the Church's authority and sowing both hope and fear across the land. Within this larger movement, the Taborites became its most radical expression. Their town of Tabor was fortified not only with stone walls, but with a vision of divine order. Men and women lived communally, property was shared, and the strongest among them dedicated themselves to the defense of faith itself. Their devotion was a living, breathing thing, ritual and duty intertwined, prayer and preparation for battle indistinguishable. Chroniclers of the era recorded both fascination and horror. They wrote of Taborites marching into battle with hymns on their lips, crossbows slung across shoulders, eyes alight with religious fervor. They fasted and prayed with equal rigor, believing that physical and spiritual discipline could summon divine favor. Even ordinary daily acts, meal, rest, movement were suffused with ritual, a constant reminder that their lives were no longer their own, but instruments of God's will. Outsiders whispered of secret counsels, of visions guiding strategy, of punishments meted out not by law, but by conviction. Persecution and conflict followed. Papal armies, fearful of this radical piety and independence, laid siege to Taborite strongholds, Villages loyal to the church resisted their influence, yet the Taborites persisted. Where others fled, they held firm, their faith both shield and weapon. Some chroniclers claimed miraculous victories. Others insisted that Taborites were possessed by divine inspiration itself, their courage and resilience bordering on the supernatural. What remains most haunting is the duality of their devotion, militant yet spiritual, ruthless yet communal, unwavering yet ephemeral. Their faith demanded total commitment, yet it left few tangible traces, ruins of walls, echoes of chants, the faintest shadow in folklore, even after their defeats. Whispers of Taborite ideals survived, inspiring movements long after the original. Towns fell in the quiet valleys of Bohemia. When mist drifts low and the wind carries only whispers, it is possible to imagine them still, walking in silent procession, eyes fixed on unseen heavens. Hearts and bodies surrendered to a devotion both radical and eternal. The Taborites remind us that faith can be a fortress, a weapon, and a law unto itself, and that even when erased from maps and histories, its echo endures, haunting the land and imagination for centuries to come. In the isolated valleys of northern Italy, where the Dolomite peaks rise jagged against a silver sky and mist coils through forests like restless spirits, there emerged a sect whose devotion was whispered of in both fear and reverence, the Dolcinians. They were the heirs of the Catholic legacy, yet even more radical, insisting that the path to salvation required the renunciation of all worldly ties, the embrace of secrecy, and a relentless pursuit of spiritual purity that left no trace for the inquisitor to follow. It was the early 14th century, a time when the church had consolidated immense power across Europe, and heresy was punished with fire and sword. Into this landscape of rigid authority and fearful obedience, the Dolcinians moved quietly, spreading their beliefs through remote villages, forests, and crumbling abbeys. They rejected wealth, property, and even traditional sacraments, insisting that the soul alone could commune with God and that the flesh was a vessel of temptation, to be subdued or denied entirely. Their devotion was austere, their lives a continual ritual of fasting, meditation, and withdrawal from the material world. Chroniclers wrote of them with alarm. They spoke of secret gatherings held at night, of men and women kneeling in abandoned chapels or hidden clearings, hands clasped in silent devotion, bodies wasted from fasting, eyes luminous with unwavering faith. Some accounts claim that the Dolcinians mortified themselves with chains or scourges, though whether these tales are truth or exaggeration is impossible to discern. Their power lay not in armies or wealth, but in an invisible, unassailable conviction that the world itself was a prison, and only the renunciation of its pleasures could free the soul. Persecution followed relentlessly. Papal bulls condemned them, inquisitors hunted them, villages suspected of harboring Dolcinians were burned, and those captured often chose death over recantation. Yet the sect proved elusive. They vanished into mountains and forests, moving quietly from place to place, preserving their teachings orally, leaving only the faintest traces of their existence. Their devotion was embodied, secret, and nearly impossible to eradicate. What remains haunting is the absolute secrecy of their faith. No texts survive, no rituals are fully recorded, and their ultimate intentions remain a mystery. Were they fanatics seeking martyrdom, mystics pursuing perfection, or simply human souls striving to touch the divine beyond the corruption of the world? Their legacy is not in monuments or documents, but in the haunting notion that devotion can survive, entirely in shadow, sustained by conviction alone. Even today, in the fog-laden valleys and abandoned chapels of northern Italy, one can imagine the Dolcinians moving silently, hands raised in prayer, eyes fixed upon unseen heavens. Their lives were a testament to faith stripped of comfort, authority, and recognition of devotion so radical it could vanish from history, and yet leave an echo that endures across centuries. In absence and silence, they remain eternal, untouchable, and profoundly mysterious. In the windswept plains of northern France, where rivers carve paths through fog-laden meadows and ruined abbeys, stand like silent sentinels, a sect arose whose faith was whispered with terror and awe, the flagellants of the Black Death. Unlike traditional monastic orders, they believed that humanity's sins could be purged not through prayer alone, but through the body itself, through suffering, blood, and ritualized self-punishment. Their devotion was violent, public, and unflinching, a manifestation of faith as raw and relentless as the plague that swept across the continent. It was the mid-14th century, a time when the Black Death had emptied cities, left fields fallow, and filled towns with silence broken only by the moan of the dying. Into this void walked the flagellants, moving in long, solemn processions from village to village. Their hands and backs bore the evidence of devotion, welts, bruises, and streams of blood mingling with the dust of the roads, chanting prayers that rose and fell like the wind through empty streets. They offered themselves as instruments of divine penance, believing that the sight of human suffering could move God's hand of mercy. Chroniclers of the time wrote with both horror and fascination. They described entire communities drawn into these rituals, men and women whipping themselves in rhythm, voices echoing across squares and courtyards, faces streaked with tears and blood. Children watched from doorways, terrified and entranced. Some chroniclers suggested that the flagellants' devotion was so intense it invited death closer, that their ritual suffering became a mirror for the plague itself, a desperate and terrifying attempt to wrest meaning from the chaos around them. The church initially tolerated the flagellants, seeing in them a sign of penitence, but their procession soon spiraled beyond control. Papal bulls condemned them as heretics, armies disrupted gatherings, and inquisitors hunted the leaders relentlessly, yet the movement persisted. Even under threat of death, flagellants continued to march. Their devotion carried not in texts or monuments, but in the rhythm of their bodies and the solemn cadence of their chants. What remains most haunting is the paradox of their faith. They saw purification through pain, yet their devotion was profoundly spiritual. The flagellants remind us that belief can become both violent and sacred, that devotion can demand sacrifice of the self in ways that terrify and mesmerize simultaneously. Even centuries later, in abandoned village squares or mist-filled fields, one can imagine them walking in silence, whips in hand, chanting prayers lost to time. Their legacy endures not in stone or scripture, but in the haunting question they leave behind. How far will the human spirit go to seek God? And what traces remain when faith is written in blood rather than words? In the misty valleys of southern Germany, where the forests are dense and the rivers wind like silver serpents, through shadow glades, there emerged a sect whose devotion was whispered of with fear and awe, the Brethren of the Free Spirit. Their belief was radical in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications, that the human soul could achieve divine perfection while still in the flesh, that earthly law and church authority were shackles, and that only by living entirely beyond sin could one truly commune with God. It was the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a time when monarchs tightened their grip over lands and the church demanded obedience. From every parish, village, and town, into this rigid order stepped the brethren, moving quietly through forests, towns, and remote monasteries. Some were men, others women. Some lived as solitary wanderers. Others gathered in small, secretive bands that carried no texts, built no churches, and yet their influence spread through whispers and fleeting encounters, unsettling both peasants and clergy. Chroniclers and inquisitors recorded them with a mix of alarm and fascination. The brethren were said to renounce property, marriage, and even modesty, believing that attachment to the world obscured the soul's connection to God. Some accounts describe ecstatic rituals, whispered prayers at twilight, and visions that left participants trembling with divine revelation. Yet much of what is written comes from fearful outsiders. The precise nature of their devotions remains a mystery, lost to secrecy and time. Persecution soon followed. Papal bulls condemned them as heretics. Inquisitors interrogated suspected members. Villages accused of harboring them were sometimes razed. And yet the brethren were elusive. They vanished into forests, mountains, and abandoned villages, reappearing where least expected. Their faith was embodied, secret, and unshakable, surviving in memory, ritual, and oral transmission rather than stone or script. The haunting mystery of the brethren lies in their disappearance. No texts survive. No codified doctrine remains. Only the echoes of fear and fascination remain, whispers carried by the wind through centuries. Their devotion was radical, intimate, and invisible to the world, yet profoundly real. Even today, in the shadow glades of Saxony and Thuringia, one can imagine them moving silently through fog, hands clasped in prayer, eyes fixed on unseen heavens. The Brethren of the Free Spirit remind us that faith can demand absolute freedom, that devotion may thrive entirely in shadow, and that some spiritual movements leave no monument but the lingering sense of awe and mystery in silence and absence. They endure eternal, untouchable, and profoundly enigmatic. Continue in the jagged mountains of northern Italy, where the Dolomites pierce a sky often veiled in mist, and ancient stone ruins cling stubbornly to cliff faces. There arose a sect whose devotion was whispered in fear and awe, the Dolcinians. They were heirs to the Catholic legacy, yet more radical. Their faith insisting that true communion with God demanded complete renunciation of the world, total secrecy, and a surrender of the self that defied understanding. It was the early 14th century, a time when the church ruled with iron authority. Inquisitors patrolled villages, and heresy was punished with fire. Into this oppressive world, the Dolcinians moved quietly, spreading their beliefs among peasants, wanderers, and even disillusioned clergy. They rejected property, marriage, and the sacraments of the church, insisting that the soul alone was pure and that the flesh, tainted by sin, must be subdued or denied entirely. Devotion was measured in fasting, meditation, and silence of life lived as ritual, every act a testament to faith. Chroniclers wrote of them with fascination and dread. They spoke of secret gatherings in abandoned chapels or forests where men and women knelt for hours in prayer, bodies wasted from fasting, eyes luminous with unwavering belief. Some accounts claimed they mortified themselves with chains or scourges, though whether these were exaggerations by fearful observers is impossible to know. Their strength lay not in weapons or numbers, but in the unyielding certainty of their faith and the secrecy that protected it. Persecution came swiftly. Papal bulls denounced them. Inquisitors interrogated and executed those they could find. Villages suspected of harboring Dolcinians were burned. Yet the sect proved elusive. They vanished into mountains and forests, reappearing elsewhere with their beliefs intact, transmitted orally, hidden in gestures and whispered prayers rather than texts or monuments. Their devotion existed entirely in shadow, sustained by discipline and secrecy. What is most haunting is the total invisibility of their faith. No writings survive. No rituals are fully recorded. Only fragments remain, preserved by the pen of those who feared them. Yet these fragments hint at a devotion so radical that it demanded disappearance itself, a surrender of self and world in pursuit of the divine. Even today, in the fog-laden valleys of northern Italy, one can imagine the Dolcinians moving silently among ruins, hands raised in prayer, eyes lifted to unseen heavens. Their lives were a testament to devotion stripped of comfort, authority, and recognition of radical faith that vanished from history yet left an indelible echo in silence, absence, and shadow. They endure eternal, unbroken, and profoundly mysterious. In the dark forests and rolling hills of Bohemia, where morning fog clings to the earth like a veil and rivers carve silent paths through the land, there emerged a sect whose devotion was as radical as it was terrifying, the Hussite Taborites. Unlike ordinary believers, their faith demanded the complete reordering of life itself, a society built on spiritual equality, communal ownership, and militant dedication to the will of God. To encounter them was to glimpse a people who had abandoned fear, wealth, and hierarchy in pursuit of divine order. It was the early 15th century, a time when Bohemia seethed with political tension, and the church's authority was increasingly challenged. Reformers had begun to question the corruption of clergy and the excesses of the papacy, and among them, the Taborites took the most radical path. In their fortress town of Tabor, stone walls enclosed a community that was both utopia and citadel. Men and women shared property, meals, and devotion alike, while the strongest among them trained to defend the town and its ideals. Believing that spiritual perfection demanded both contemplation and action, chroniclers of the time wrote of the Taborites with a mixture of fascination and fear. They described men marching into battle with psalms on their lips, crossbows and pikes in hand, eyes burning with unshakable faith. They fasted with rigor, prayed without pause and discipline. Their bodies, until flesh itself, seemed a tool of devotion. Outsiders whispered of secret councils where visions guided strategy, of punishments enacted by spiritual law rather than secular authority, and of a people whose lives were entirely consumed by the pursuit of God. Persecution was inevitable. Papal armies besieged their towns, loyalist nobles resisted their influence, and many Taborites were killed or dispersed. Yet the movement endured. Survivors moved quietly through forests and valleys, spreading their ideals orally, keeping the memory of communal purity and unwavering faith alive even when the stone walls of Tabor have fallen. What remains haunting is the paradox of their devotion, militant yet spiritual, communal yet fiercely individual, radical yet invisible to history. Their faith demanded total surrender, yet left almost no permanent trace, even centuries later. The mist-laden hills and abandoned valleys seem to echo with their chants. the faint shadow of their presence lingering in ruins and whispers. The Taborites remind us that faith can be a fortress, a weapon, and a law unto itself, and that even when erased from maps and histories, its echo endures. In silence, absence, and shadow, their devotion persists in yielding, radical, and eternal. In the remote valleys of Galicia, where forests rise like dark cathedrals and rivers wind silently through misted plains, there existed a sect whose devotion was as enigmatic as it was feared, the Bogomils. Their faith was a whisper against the established order, a radical vision that proclaimed the material world a prison crafted by a malevolent force, and the human soul its captive. Salvation, they believed, could only be achieved by rejecting worldly attachments, renouncing the corrupt church, and seeking communion with the divine through purity and secrecy. It was the 10th century, and the lands of Bulgaria and surrounding regions were a tapestry of political strife and spiritual ferment. Christianity had been imposed, yet old pagan practices lingered in shadows and secret groves. Into this unsettled world, the Bogomils emerged quietly, spreading their doctrine among peasants, merchants, and even the occasional disillusioned monk. They preached that flesh was temptation, that material wealth was deceit, and that obedience to earthly authority was surrender to a corrupt creation. Chroniclers and later inquisitors wrote of them with awe and alarm. They described secret gatherings in forests, abandoned churches, and hidden valleys, where prayers were whispered, rituals performed in near silence, and the faithful moved with a solemnity that unnerved outsiders. Some accounts hint at extreme ascetic practices, fasting for days, nights spent in vigil, and renunciation of all earthly pleasures. Yet whether these tales reflect reality or the exaggerations of fearful observers is impossible to discern. What remains undeniable is the intensity of their devotion and the fear it inspired. Persecution was relentless. Imperial authorities, allied with the church, sought to destroy them. Villages were razed, members executed, and teachings outlawed. Yet the Bogomils proved elusive. They disappeared in the forests and mountains, preserving their beliefs through oral transmission, secrecy, and ritual. Where armies marched, they vanished. Where inquisitors investigated, they left no trace. Their faith existed entirely in shadow, a devotion that could not be captured, only glimpsed fleetingly. What is most haunting is the absolute invisibility of their legacy. No texts survive, no codified practices remain. Only fragments recorded by enemies hint at a radical devotion that dared to live entirely outside the world's laws. Yet in those fragments, one senses a faith so profound it could reshape hearts and communities without leaving a mark on stone or paper. Even now, in Galicia's forests and valleys, the mist seems to whisper their presence. The Bogomils move silently in memory, unseen but enduring, a faith that survives in absence, in shadow, and in the lingering question: can devotion be so radical that it vanishes from history, yet endures eternally in the spaces between? In that silence, they remain eternal, unbroken, and hauntingly alive. Continue in the remote hills of southern France, where crumbling abbeys cling to cliffs and the wind sweeps through forests. With a mournful sigh, there arose a sect whose devotion was both radiant and terrifying, the Catha Perfecti. Unlike ordinary believers, they sought a purity so absolute that it demanded the rejection of the material world itself. Flesh, wealth, and earthly authority were shackles to be cast off, and only through extreme asceticism could the soul glimpse the divine. It was the 12th and 13th centuries, a time when the church wielded immense power, lords enforced secular law, and ordinary people feared both plagues and tyranny. Amid this landscape, the Cathars flourished in secret valleys and hidden villages, preaching that the world was created by a false god, a corrupt demiurge, and that true salvation lay in detachment, spiritual rigor, and a life devoted entirely to the invisible light. Those who ascended to the rank of perfecti renounced all worldly ties, moving from community to community as living examples of devotion. Their every gesture and breath a ritual. Chroniclers and inquisitors recorded them with awe and horror. They spoke of men and women who fasted for days without sustenance, who spent nights in prayer until their bodies shook with exhaustion, whose eyes burned with the serene intensity of the unworldly. Their most sacred rite, the consolamentum, was a baptism of the Spirit that liberated the soul from the cycle of birth and sin, a gift to be earned only through years of discipline and unwavering faith. Witnesses described their movements as ethereal, their words rare, but weighty. Their presence suffused with a quiet authority that defied earthly law. Persecution soon followed. Papal armies swept through villages, inquisitors interrogated and executed the faithful, and communities were raised to erase the memory of their devotion. Yet the perfecti were elusive. Many vanished in the forests, mountains, or abandoned ruins, carrying their teachings orally, preserving their faith in silence, secrecy, and ritual. Their devotion became invisible, leaving no monuments or codices, only fleeting echoes in the chronicles of those who feared them. What remains haunting is the paradox of their existence. Their lives were devoted entirely to light, yet they were hunted and often destroyed by men who claimed to serve the same God. Even centuries later, the ruins of Languedoc, the stones of empty churches, and the shadowed valleys seem to whisper of the Perfecti's passage. Their devotion endures in absence, a testament to faith unbound by fear, imperishable despite erasure, and eternal in its quiet, radiant intensity. In the stillness of those valleys, one can imagine them kneeling in silence, hands folded, eyes lifted toward unseen heavens, a people utterly surrendered to God. The Perfecti remind us that devotion can demand the impossible, to renounce the world entirely, to live unseen, to endure suffering in pursuit of the light. And in that renunciation, they endure still, a luminous shadow, eternal, ineffable, and profoundly haunting. In the shadowed hills of Lombardy, where the mist drifts low across abandoned abbeys and the gurgling rivers wind like silver threads through dark forests, there existed a sect whose devotion inspired both reverence and dread, the Dulcinians. They were the spiritual heirs of the Cathars, yet even more radical in their pursuit of purity, insisting that salvation required the complete renunciation of the world, the denial of flesh, and the concealment of their faith in utter secrecy. Their lives were a tapestry of austerity, silence, and devotion so extreme that even the inquisitors who hunted them could rarely follow their path. It was the early 14th century, a time when the Church's authority reached its zenith and heresy was met with swift, merciless punishment. Into this landscape of fear and control, the Dulcinians moved quietly, spreading their teachings among peasants, wanderers, and disillusioned clergy. They rejected property, marriage, and the sacraments of the Church, claiming that only the soul alone could commune with God, and that the flesh, tainted by sin, must be subdued or denied entirely. Devotion was measured in fasting, prayer, and prolonged meditation, every act a ritual, every day a testament to faith. Chroniclers wrote of them in tones both alarmed and fascinated. They spoke of clandestine meetings in forests or ruined chapels, of men and women kneeling for hours, bodies wasted by hunger and austerity, eyes bright with unwavering faith. Some accounts describe self-mortification with chains or scourges. Though whether these reports were truth or fearful exaggeration is impossible to know, their strength lay not in numbers or weapons, but in an unshakable conviction and a discipline so profound that it rendered them almost invisible to the world. Persecution came swiftly. Papal bulls condemned them, inquisitors interrogated and executed the faithful, villages suspected of harboring Dulcinians were burned, and yet the sect endured. Survivors vanished into mountains and forests, preserving teachings orally, passing rituals and wisdom by whispered instruction. Their devotion existed entirely in shadow, hidden but unbroken, ephemeral yet enduring. What is most haunting is the total invisibility of their faith. No codices survive, no monuments mark their passage, and the precise details of their rituals remain unknown. Yet the intensity of their devotion lingers, a testament to a radical pursuit of the divine that demanded disappearance itself. Even now, in the misted valleys and abandoned chapels of northern Italy, one can imagine them moving silently, hands raised in prayer, eyes fixed on unseen heavens. Their lives were a surrender of comfort, authority, and recognition of devotion so extreme that it vanished from history yet left an echo eternal. In silence, in absence, and in shadow, the Dulcinians endure untouchable, enigmatic, and profoundly haunting in the forests and marshes of northern Germany, where the morning mist clings to the ground like a shroud, and the wind whispers through the gnarled trees. There arose a sect whose faith was both radical and invisible, the Brethren of the Free Spirit. Their devotion was unlike any other. It demanded the renunciation of earthly law, the rejection of human authority, and the belief that the soul could commune directly with God while still trapped in the body. To live fully in the Spirit, they believed, was to rise above sin entirely, to walk free of worldly constraints, and to embody holiness in its purest, most terrifying form. It was the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a time when the church sought to control thought, behavior, and devotion, and when the penalties for heresy were severe and unyielding. Into this world of rigid orthodoxy, the brethren appeared quietly, moving from village to village, forest to forest, often alone, sometimes in secretive bands. Some were women, some men, all committed to a life of radical freedom, believing that obedience to the world was the last vestige of corruption. Their practices were subtle, almost invisible. Whispered prayers at twilight, fasting, vigil, and contemplative journeys into isolation. Chroniclers and inquisitors wrote of them with alarm. They were said to renounce marriage, property, and modesty itself, claiming that worldly attachments obscured the soul's connection to God. Some accounts describe ecstatic rituals, visions that left participants trembling with revelation, and acts of devotion that defied conventional morality. Yet the truth is impossible to discern. The brethren existed largely outside documentation, surviving in oral memory and the fearful whispers of outsiders. Persecution followed swiftly. Papal bulls condemned them, inquisitors hunted suspected members, and entire villages accused of harboring them were interrogated or destroyed. And yet, the brethren were elusive. They vanished into forests, mountains, and abandoned villages, carrying their teachings orally, preserving their devotion in silence and secrecy. Where armies marched, they disappeared. Where inquisitors investigated, they left no trace. The most haunting aspect of the brethren is the absolute invisibility of their faith. No texts survive. No codified rituals remain. Only echoes persist, fragments preserved in fearful chronicles. Hints of devotion lived entirely in shadow. Even centuries later, the forests of Saxony and Thuringia seem to breathe with their presence, and the mind can imagine them moving silently through mystic glades, hands clasped in prayer, eyes lifted to unseen heavens. The brethren of the free spirit remind us that faith can demand absolute freedom, that devotion may thrive entirely in shadow, and that some spiritual movements leave no monument but the lingering sense of awe and mystery. In silence, absence, and shadow, they endure eternal, untouchable, and profoundly enigmatic. Continue in the remote valleys of northern Italy, where jagged mountains rise like stone sentinels and fog coils through the forests like restless spirits. There existed a sect whose devotion was whispered of with awe and fear, the Dolcinians. They were heirs of the Cathars, yet even more radical, their faith insisting that true communion with God demanded the total renunciation of the world, the denial of the flesh, and the concealment of all outward signs of belief. Their lives were a rhythm of austerity, secrecy, and devotion so consuming that even those who hunted them could rarely glimpse their existence. It was the early 14th century, a time when the church's authority extended across Europe, and inquisitors patrolled villages and valleys in search of heresy. Into this world of fear and control, the Dolcinians moved quietly, spreading their teachings among peasants, wandering mystics, and disillusioned clerics. They rejected property, marriage, and the sacraments, claiming that only the soul alone could commune with God, and that the material world was a prison designed to entrap the spirit. Every action became ritual, every day a testament to faith. Chroniclers recorded them with fascination and dread. They spoke of secret gatherings in ruined chapels or forests at twilight, of men and women kneeling for hours, bodies thin from fasting, eyes luminous with devotion. Some claimed the Dolcinians mortified themselves with chains or scourges, though whether these reports were truth or exaggeration is impossible to know. What is certain is that their power lay not in armies or wealth, but in a conviction so deep it rendered them invisible to the world of faith that could not be captured by fire or sword. Persecution followed relentlessly. Papal bulls condemned them. Inquisitors interrogated and executed the faithful, and villages suspected of harboring them were burned. Yet the Dolcinians proved elusive. Survivors vanished into mountains, forests, and abandoned settlements, preserving teachings orally, transmitting ritual and belief in silence. Their devotion existed entirely in shadow, hidden yet unbroken, ephemeral yet eternal. What is most haunting is their invisibility. No codices survive, no monuments mark their passage, and the precise nature of their rituals is lost. Yet the intensity of their faith lingers, a testament to a devotion so radical that it demanded disappearance itself. Even now, in the mist-laden valleys and abandoned chapels of northern Italy, one can imagine them moving silently, hands raised in prayer, eyes fixed on unseen heavens. The Dolcinians remind us that devotion can survive entirely in shadow, that faith may demand the impossible, and that some spiritual movements leave no trace but the echo of their conviction. In silence, absence, and shadow, they endure untouchable, enigmatic, and profoundly haunting. In the windswept plains and forested hills of Bohemia, where morning fog hangs like a veil and the rivers carve silent paths through the land, there rose a sect whose faith was as radical as it was terrifying, the Taborites. They were not merely believers. They were visionaries and warriors of devotion, seeking to create a society entirely ordered by divine law, where earthly hierarchies, property, and sin had no place. Their town of Tabor was both fortress and utopia, a living experiment in faith, made flesh. It was the early 15th century, a time when Europe teetered on the edge of political upheaval and religious reformation. The Hussite movement had ignited a revolution of thought and belief, challenging the power of the church and the crown alike. Among its factions, the Taborites stood as the most radical, insisting that salvation required both spiritual purity and the courage to defend it. Men and women lived communally, sharing everything, training for defense, fasting, praying, and preparing their bodies and spirits for the trials of devotion. Chroniclers describe them with a mixture of awe and fear. They wrote of Taborite warriors, marching into battle with hymns on their lips, crossbows slung across shoulders, eyes blazing with unshakable faith. Fasting, prayer, and discipline governed every aspect of life, and even ordinary tasks were imbued with ritual significance. Secret councils, whispered visions, and punishments meted out by spiritual law rather than secular authority marked a society entirely devoted to the divine. Outsiders spoke of them in hushed tones. Fearful of their discipline, courage, and relentless devotion, persecution came swiftly. Papal armies besieged their strongholds. Loyalist nobles resisted their influence, and many Taborites were killed or forced into exile. Yet even as walls fell and communities were destroyed, their ideals endured. Survivors moved quietly through forests and valleys, preserving teachings orally, passing down rituals and visions that would shape faith and thought. Long after the town of Tabor had disappeared from maps, what remains haunting is the paradox of their devotion, militant yet spiritual, communal yet fiercely individual, radical yet almost invisible in history. Even centuries later, the fog-laden hills and abandoned valleys seem to echo with the Taborites' chants, the faint shadow of their presence lingering in ruins and whispers. They remind us that faith can be both fortress and weapon, law and sanctuary, and that even when erased from history, the conviction of the soul endures. In silence, absence, and shadow, the Taborites persist in yielding, radical and eternal.